You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode number 68. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, my friend. Welcome back to the podcast. It's Paula here, and I'm so delighted to have you join me this week. Today's topic is one that I just love talking about. We are talking about procrastination, and I'm going to help you go from dread, distraction, and avoidance to getting things done. And this is a topic that resonates so strongly for me. Number one, when I have clients talk to me about procrastination, I feel a deep sense of joy. And it's not because my clients are procrastinating, because I know what it's like to procrastinate. I think there's a lot of guilt and shame and negative self-talk that comes along with procrastinating. We feel like we should be doing things better, we should not be delaying, etc. But the reason that I feel so much joy is that I know that I can help them. I know that there are tricks and techniques and things that you can understand about yourself to help you overcome that gap and to transition from that place of pushing things off to getting things done. And so when I see that there's an opportunity for me to really make a difference in somebody's practice, I'm just so keen to jump in and help them out. So today's podcast episode is recorded with so much love and the opposite of procrastination. Sometimes I find myself procrastinating on recording my podcast. Sometimes, I have trouble thinking of the topic or, what are we going to talk about this week? Or am I saying this right? But for today's episode, I really just feel the opposite of all of those things. I'm excited. I'm not distracted at all. And I'm focused today on helping you get some skills and tools and ideas for how you can overcome procrastination when it comes up in your practice. And one of the reasons I thought talking about procrastination would be timely is that it's kind of that back to school time, at least at the time of recording this podcast. We just got back from the vacation I mentioned in our last podcast a couple of days ago. Now, we are not fully settled. I just realized before recording today that I've still got a full suitcase of clothing for the whole family. I've got about 4 piles of laundry that are waiting to be folded. And so perhaps I am procrastinating a little bit on some of those things. But really what inspired this episode was when I sat down yesterday at my computer for the first time in almost a week and tried to identify what I needed to do this week and next. So it's kind of that feeling of overwhelm. Where do I start? I really don't want to do this. This is uncomfortable. And I thought there are probably a lot of you out there who are going through the same thing, where your summers are wrapping up. You're getting back into the swing of a full practice. And wouldn't it be nice to have a little bit of extra help to navigate that transition back to work? And I think what happens is when you're on vacation in particular, you kind of lose the momentum of being in your daily workflow. And when you sit back down at your computer, it can feel really heavy. It can feel hard to get started on tasks. It can feel overwhelming. There are so many things that you might need to do, so many emails to go through, so many priorities that you need to sort through. And so this episode is designed to help you get some strategies to make that transition easier. So today we are going to be talking about procrastination, which you might also think about as difficulty initiating tasks. And we're going to talk about why it exists, how it might show up in your practice. I'm also going to offer you some strategies to overcome procrastination. So starting with the why, why is it that we procrastinate? And I do not exclude myself from this list. I will tell you, I have made major inroads when it comes to procrastination. As a student, particularly as a law student, I used to I didn't love leaving things to the last minute, but I did it. I would especially in law school where so much of it was readings based and you kind of did that at your own pace, I would often leave things till pretty late in the game. And it wasn't the best way really to study or to learn. And I've learned over the years, partly while practicing as a lawyer and particularly as a coach, how to deal with procrastination, really what drives it, and some tools to help deal with it. So I can tell you that now I'm a lot better at managing procrastination. Sometimes I'm not necessarily managing it. Maybe I see it and I realize what I'm doing, but at least that awareness is there. So for all of you listening, I hope that this is really a transition point for you if this is something that you struggle with. And if you don't really struggle with procrastination, this might be a nice refining of your existing practices. You might think of some tools here. You might hear some ideas you haven't really thought of before to help you shore up your own practices. So number one, why is this a problem? Well, I think the reason that we procrastinate or that you procrastinate is because you are human and we all have tasks that we do not want to do. And the tendency to procrastinate is completely natural. We are hardwired to avoid pain and pursue pleasure. And so if there's something that you see on your plate as being painful that you do not want to do, it's completely natural to push that off and perhaps in its place, do something that brings you a little bit more pleasure. Now, procrastination or not doing task initiation is part of your executive function. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today engages with that. So your executive function, of course, is when you're using the more advanced or evolved part of your brain to do certain things. And task initiation is one of the many elements of executive function. Other common executive functions, usually there's about 8 to 12 on the list, depending on who's talking about executive function. But I thought some of the other executive functions that were relevant to procrastination are organization. So if you're not particularly well organized, then you might have trouble initiating just because there's so much clutter and confusion going on around you. Planning is part of the executive function. So your ability to think ahead and strategize for the future. Prioritizing, so looking at a number of different items on your to-do list and deciding which of those is most important, what needs to get done first and when and how. Self-monitoring, so the idea of being self-reflective and being able to keep tabs on yourself, essentially. Emotional control is a key component of executive function. So you might think of that in terms of your ability to control your temper, for example, when something doesn't go your way. I think it can also play into procrastination when you let your emotions, so we talk about dread of not wanting to do a task, when you let that emotion kind of take over and guide your actions. And finally, impulse control is another executive function. So you can see how you might sit down to do your work and then something a little bit more interesting, a shiny object appears on the corner of your screen and you want to go for it. And so in a sense, these are all executive functions that can play into your task initiation or your tendency to procrastinate. And I would just like you to keep those in mind. But today we're really focusing on that initiation piece. Now, as I mentioned, we all procrastinate. And I've titled this podcast Dread, Distraction, and Avoidance because these are three elements that are quite common when you're procrastinating. So you might think about what tasks you dread. And we all have tasks that we put off. And I'd invite you to think about what you are putting off. Sometimes it's the emails, it's billing, it's tidying your desk, it's getting that pile of filing together that you're going to hand over to your assistant. Maybe you have a practice where you're required to do some of the admin, so saving emails, things that are typically not urgent, but important. Those are tasks that are very easy to put off. Sometimes it's big picture planning. If you know that you want to be strategic about how the next few months are going to unfold, maybe you've got a big file that you're working on and you need to break it down into smaller pieces. There's lots of places where you might be procrastinating. It can also be conversations you don't want to have. Those are big ones. Maybe you've got a bit of a conflict that's brewing with somebody that you work with. Maybe it's somebody who is your boss, a colleague. Maybe it's another lawyer or staff member at your office who you need to have a conversation with. So there's all these situations where you might be putting things off. And I would invite you to reflect on where it's coming up for you and to think about that in relation to today's episode. Now, it may also be, in addition to tasks, that there are periods where you tend to procrastinate. So I gave the example at the beginning of today's episode of returning from a vacation, right? Where you're back in the office and it's really hard to get back into your seat, look at your computer and decide what needs to be done and then execute. It may also be working on a certain type of file. You may find that a certain type of work tends to be boring to you. You don't find it as exhilarating as you would like. And so you tend to push things off a little bit. A lack of urgency is a big one. I know for myself, this is one that I struggle with. When there's a lack of urgency, sometimes it takes me a long time to actually implement a task. I spend more time thinking about it because I have that time to think about it. So maybe you can relate to that. It may also be that you have upsets inside or outside of work. So maybe somebody walks by your office, they give you a strange look, and you find yourself ruminating over what it was that you must have said to that person that caused them to give you that look. Or you have a call with a client, you have to deliver some news, the conversation turns awkward. And so you get off that call, and instead of jumping straight into your next task, you find yourself drifting, thinking, perseverating, and it keeps you from actually making progress. It could equally be somebody outside of work. Maybe you have a fight with a friend or a family member, or there's something going on with one of your kids at school, and you just find that you're distracted. And finally, it may also be that there are certain times of day where you're just not all that productive. So for some people, that's right after lunch. There's a bit of a slump, and you may find that during those periods, you find it a lot harder to initiate tasks, particularly the ones that you dread. Now, we also mentioned distraction, and we all know that in today's world, there is no shortage of inputs, and there are notifications on your phone, on your computer. There's your email to check. Maybe there's multiple emails for you to check. There's social media, if that's something that you are into. There's updates on files. There are all sorts of distractions. Of course, you could also seek out those distractions, right? Maybe you sit down and you think, wait a minute, but there's another email I need to respond to, or you can overhear a conversation in the hallway. Or maybe there's, a file and you're thinking, well, what about that thing that happened? Or you suddenly remember something and then you feel like you need to act on it right away. And what I have noticed is that the more dreaded the task, the easier it is to fall prey to these distractions, the distractions that are going on outside of you, and also the distractions that are going on inside of you, because you can turn off the notifications on your phone, but you cannot turn off your brain. And so if you are ruminating over something and you cannot turn it off, it becomes a lot harder to overcome that distraction. And it's a lot more challenging for you to put that to the side and initiate the task that you are trying to accomplish. And finally, I mentioned avoidance. And I mentioned that because I think ultimately that's what we're doing when we're procrastinating. We're avoiding the task that we tell ourselves that we want to do. And so chances are when you are in that avoidance state, it's not like you're avoiding a task and then having a really good time, right? I rarely hear from clients that they were procrastinating on writing a brief, or they were putting off making a call to the client, and instead they went out to dinner with their friends and had a lot of fun, or they went and took a holiday somewhere, or they engaged in an activity that was actually enjoyable. Most of the time, when you are procrastinating, you're doing something that you don't even particularly like. I know for myself, that kind of looks like sitting at my computer, Googling something random on the internet that isn't really urgent, but it feels like it's urgent and important, and it, most importantly, keeps me from doing the task that I'm truly dreading. So you might think about what it is that you're avoiding and how you're spending your time avoiding. Is it truly time well spent? And my guess is that it's not. And what I would also offer to you is that that type of procrastination often looks a certain way. So some people talk about procrastivity, which is really keeping busy doing something instead of the task that you told yourself you would do. So procrastivity might be keeping busy with non-essential work items like sending emails or planning your day or learning something or getting a snack. These are things that are probably important. They're probably things that need to get done at some point, but you're putting them in the place of the thing that you really need to do. And that's where there's a bit of a problem. Procrastinative research is another one. Sometimes you might find yourself doing all sorts of research, getting to the bottom of everything in a way to put off doing something that you do not want to do. Perfectionism can be tied in with your procrastination. I have a whole podcast episode about perfectionism, but sometimes you might spend so much time getting ready to do the task, making sure that your desk is perfectly in order, making sure you have all the tools you need, you have every single highlighter pen that you could possibly imagine. And as a result, you don't actually start to initiate the task. You avoid it. So these are some of the things that you might experience in relation to procrastination. And we're going to talk more about how you can overcome these challenges. Now, chances are you've tried to overcome procrastination. I know for most of the clients that I have worked with where we've talked about procrastination, you already have some really good tools that you have developed in order to overcome your procrastination. So hopefully today's podcast episode is going to help you supplement the tools that already work for you. And if you have tools that work for you, I encourage you to build on those, because that truly is the way to form new habits, is to build where you're already strong. What I see among the clients I work with is that what you have likely tried is making promises to yourself that you ultimately do not keep. So you tell yourself you're going to sit down and at 10 a.m. you're going to write the brief. You're going to do that between 10 and 11, and 10 o'clock rolls around and you decide, you may not decide consciously, I don't want to write the brief, but maybe you start checking your emails. You see there's something else that looks a little bit shiny. Maybe it seems like it could be urgent. Maybe you get up to double check something, get a coffee, talk to a colleague. Anything can really happen. And what ends up happening is that you don't do the task that you promised yourself you would do. And then it can spiral into a lot of negative self-talk where you tell yourself, I'm unreliable. I always procrastinate. I never do the things that I tell myself I'm going to do. And it may also be that you are creating unrealistic goals for yourself. So it may be that you set yourself up to start at 10, knowing that you're going to need a little bit of a buffer time to get settled, to get oriented. And by not setting yourself up well, by creating a goal that's not realistic, you don't give yourself the chance to follow through and build up that muscle and trust with yourself that you can truly initiate those tasks without procrastination. And what happens is you then end up breaking the trust that you have with yourself that you'll actually get things done. You may start to identify yourself as a procrastinator. So there's a subtle distinction there, but it's an important one. You might think of yourself as somebody who sometimes procrastinates, and that is quite different from I am a procrastinator, because in the former, you're seeing yourself as someone who does this on occasion. You are distinguishing between yourself and the act of procrastinating. Whereas if you're identifying yourself as a procrastinator, it's like you've adopted that into your identity. And that's something that we really want to pull apart. We want to separate who you are from the act of procrastination. Now, what can happen is if you do find yourself getting into that zone where you are procrastinating and further identifying yourself as a procrastinator, you can then start working against yourself. So that's when you might have a thought loop where you're dreading doing a task. You therefore start to distract yourself or fall victim to the distractions that are around you when you're trying to do the task. And you end up avoiding doing that task altogether instead of working with yourself and your strengths in order to get the thing done. And when you fall into that thought loop, when you fall into that pattern of not initiating on tasks and procrastinating, you end up weakening that muscle. So if you think of your executive functioning skills as muscles, the more you practice them, the stronger they get. And conversely, if you're not practicing them, then you find yourself getting weaker. So if you're looking at your muscle for task initiation, the one that bridges the gap between knowing that you want to do something and actually doing that thing, then you're not building that muscle. And in previous podcast episodes, I've talked about this concept of neuroplasticity, which is essentially that we can train our brain to do certain things, to default to a certain way of thinking. Our brains want to be efficient. And so where we have well-rehearsed thoughts, where we have well-rehearsed practices, the neural connections in our brain actually develop, it's called a myelin sheath. And that's actually like a superhighway that connects certain thoughts. So if you become really good at procrastinating, you will do more of that. Whereas if you get really good at task initiation, that will become your default and it will become so much easier. So the purpose of today's podcast episode is to help you develop your practice of task initiation so that you develop that habit. It becomes more reflexive. It is stronger than your habit of procrastination. And that therefore becomes your default. So we're training your executive function. We're deliberately manipulating and reprogramming your brain and its wiring so that you shift away from procrastination and moving into action. And to do that, I'm going to offer you 5 suggestions. And we're going to start with number 1, which is to identify the usual suspects. So I invited you at the beginning of today's podcast episode to think about where it is that you typically procrastinate in your practice. And like I said, it may be tasks, so difficult conversations, large projects that may seem overwhelming, thorny legal problems that you're reluctant to jump into. It may be that you procrastinate based on the time of day. So for some of you, early morning is not a good time for you to jump into a deep thinking task. For myself, that is the best time. But I get that everybody is wired differently. You can think of that as your chronotype. You can look that up. And really what that means is that there are certain times of day where you are more efficient, more effective. And so there will be times naturally during the course of the day where you're less likely to follow through on that task initiation. So you might start to see patterns once you start to look for it. Typically, for a lot of clients I work with, the morning is actually their best time, and after lunch is the worst time. So think about what that might look like for you. Mid-afternoon is also a slump period, that 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock window where you no longer have that, sometimes after lunch you've had a break, and so you're refreshed going back to your work. 3 or 4 rolls around and you might be really tired. So think about what that looks like for you, because the less energy you have naturally, the more difficult it will be to initiate a task, especially one that you may be dreading or trying to avoid. Again, we spoke earlier about the type of work that you're doing. So if it's an assignment that is urgent, chances are you won't have a lot of trouble getting motivated because you know the pressure's on, you know it needs to be done within a certain time frame. Versus those non-urgent tasks, when you've got weeks and weeks and weeks to get something done and there's no urgency, it can be a lot harder to get yourself motivated to actually start the task. Another area where you might let things slide, this is something that I know I've done before, is where you have already been procrastinating. There's a tendency to want to push it off even further. And this gets really hairy, especially if it's an email that you haven't responded to or the deadline is coming up and you just keep pushing it off further because you feel like, number one, you're going to have to explain yourself. Number two, you feel like because it's taken you so long already that what you deliver needs to be absolutely perfect. And if it's not, then how do you justify how much time it took you to actually respond to it? There's all sorts of internal stories that we can tell ourselves that actually make those tasks even harder to initiate, which unfortunately, it's counterintuitive, and it has that compounding effect of not only procrastinating, but procrastinating on something we've already been procrastinating on. So if that's you, you're not alone, but it is an area that you might find is applicable to you. And finally, there are these big picture areas where you may find yourself procrastinating, often because they're not urgent. And so this is something I know I can relate to. I know a lot of my clients can relate to this, but when you're putting off those big picture pieces, so sometimes you're not happy with the office dynamics. So I mentioned earlier, it might be a conversation that you need to have with somebody about the way things are going. It might be more serious than that. It might be that you have found that you're really not enjoying your work anymore, and either you need to change something pretty significant where you are or move somewhere else. It may be that your time management is becoming really problematic, right? The way that you run your practice is starting to catch up with you. You're feeling increasingly stressed out because your deadlines seem to creep up on you without even realizing it. If you are truly procrastinating in a lot of areas, then you might find you're at the whim or your practice runs you instead of the other way around. And if that's how you feel, then it becomes even more overwhelming, and you may find that you're procrastinating on that even more. It's like you don't even want to deal with it. Your professional growth might be an area where you procrastinate. So you may know long run where you are right now, what you're doing right now isn't going to serve you. It's not going to get you to where you want to be ultimately. However, the thing you would need to do, the conversations you would need to have, what you would need to actually bring yourself to do, whether that's getting a new job, asking for more challenging work, whether it's getting additional training, there are things that may be holding you back because you simply don't want to do them. So I've gone through a list of suspects, the usual suspects that may apply to you. And so think about how this plays out for you in terms of your practice, and have one of those examples in mind as we go through the other suggestions I have for dealing with procrastination. So number one, identify the usual suspects. Number two, identify the feeling. Now, the reason I start with the feeling is that there is a correlation between what we think, how we feel, and what we do. How we think drives how we feel drives what we do. So I'll give you an example. And before I do that, I just wanted to say the reason that we're starting with the feelings is that often it's a lot easier for us to identify the feeling first. We sense that at a visceral level before we become aware of the thought that is feeding that feeling. So in the example that I'm going to give you, let's say you have a brief that you need to write. Maybe it's a legal opinion. Maybe it's a really long memo. Maybe you're writing an argument for court. Maybe you're able to jump into a contract that you're drafting that is really thorny. There's a lot of issues in it and you're not really sure where to start. If you sit down to write it and the feeling is dread or self-doubt or overwhelm, chances are you're going to avoid getting started on that project. Now, if you contrast that with something where you would be eager to sit down and do it, like today's podcast episode, for example, I feel really good about it. I was excited to jump in. What does that feel like? And the feeling that's associated with that might be excitement, right? You're eager, you're keen. It might be clarity, knowing exactly what you need to do. It might be confident that you have the skills to do the work. So I invite you to think about tasks that you enjoy doing, where you rarely have that procrastination. And what is it that you are feeling in that moment? And I can likely guarantee, okay, maybe not guarantee, but my guess is that the action that follows that feeling is taking action. You go ahead and you do the thing without putting it off. So go back to your usual suspects and think about how you feel when you're confronted with having to do that work. And some of the feelings that you might be experiencing, ones that are common with lawyers that I work with, sometimes it's self-doubt. Sometimes it's overwhelm, that feeling of just having too much to do or the project is too big and you don't know where to start. It may be indecision. What do you do with this? Do you have to make a decision? What if you let somebody down? What if you get it wrong? Maybe it's anxiety or fear. Maybe you fear that your work's not going to be as good as the work of the lawyer down the hall, or your clients aren't going to like the response. Sometimes you're delivering bad news and that can make it awkward. It may be that you feel like you have imposter syndrome, like somehow you're not qualified to be giving the opinion that you're about to give. And you might feel rushed. And I put this one down because this is something that I experience and I have noticed this recently. Sometimes I put things off because I feel like I don't have time to do them. And what ends up happening is that then I don't create the time to do them. So that might be something that applies to you as well, especially with those tasks that are not urgent, but important, like the long-term planning. So once you've identified the feeling that you associate with the task that you're procrastinating on or that you're not initiating, then I would invite you to think about the thoughts that stand behind the feeling. So, for example, let's say that the feeling that you experience is dread, self-doubt, and overwhelm, thinking about that task, the opinion that you're not writing, the contract that you're not drafting, the memo that you're not writing. And what are you thinking about it? It may be that you're thinking it will take a long time. It may be that you're thinking, I don't know what I'm going to say. And maybe that first idea, it will take a long time. Maybe that's what's causing the overwhelm. I don't know what I'm going to say. Maybe that's creating self-doubt or a lack of confidence. There are so many cases to read through. Maybe that's what you're thinking. And maybe that just causes dread or anxiety or possibly overwhelm. You might be thinking my colleague, boss, somebody else would be so much better at this. They'd be so much faster. They have better experience than I do. Maybe it's that feeling of imposter syndrome that is showing up. So I would invite you to think about the feelings that you're having and what are the thoughts that you have that lead to that feeling. Conversely, again, going back to the example where you feel good about a task, where you can't wait to initiate, what is it that you're thinking that are leading to your feeling? So if your feeling is clarity and confidence, maybe you're thinking to yourself, I just need to sketch the outline today. That's all I need to do. Or I'm just going to focus on what is most important here. I will take the first step. I'll set a timer. I'll focus on this until lunch. So you might be telling yourself something that automatically addresses feelings of self-doubt, imposter syndrome, overwhelm, and gives yourself a more positive narrative. So I would invite you to think about what are the thoughts that are driving the feelings that you're having when you are procrastinating. And I'm going to give you some more examples. So for self-doubt, maybe you're thinking other people have the answers and you don't. If it's overwhelm, maybe you're thinking there is too much to do and then you shut down. If it's confusion or indecision, you might think, I don't know where to start. I don't know what to do. I have trouble sorting through the tasks and deciding what to do first. If it's anxiety or fear, you might be telling yourself that it needs to be perfect and you don't want to make the wrong decision. If it is imposter syndrome, you might be telling yourself, I'm not qualified to do this. Somebody else is better at this than I am. If you're feeling rushed, again, it might be, I don't have time for this. And as we've talked about before, the feeling that ultimately is caused by the thought drives the action, and the action is typically inaction, right? It's procrastination. It's not initiating the task. Sometimes it's not completing a task. Now that is a whole other executive function, that idea of sustaining focus and finishing something, carrying it through to the end. We're not talking about that today, but that is in the realm of executive function. But what we're talking about here is what happens when you think that way, when you feel that way. Typically things don't get done. That's when you procrastinate. So that's number 3. And number 4 is to work on the thought. So we're looking at the thought, the feeling, and the action. And we want to go back to that root. We want to go back to that thought. We want to start practicing thoughts that are a little bit more productive. And I'm going to tell you how to do that because you have leverage here. And once you start recognizing the pattern of procrastination, when you know what your triggers are and you've uncovered the underlying thoughts, now you can start playing with them and figure out, are there different ways of thinking about the situation to make it easier for you? So when you think about tasks that you don't struggle with, what are some of the thoughts that you think about them? So I'll give you some examples of empowering thoughts. One of them, if it's self-doubt that troubles you, maybe the new thought for you or a better thought for you is, I can figure this out. Right? There have been times where I've had a project that was similar in difficulty or complexity. I didn't know where to start, but I figured it out and I'm going to figure it out again. So maybe that's the internal messaging that you want to be giving to yourself. If the feeling is overwhelmed, maybe what you can tell yourself is, I know how to break it down into pieces. Maybe it's, I can do anything for 5 minutes, or maybe it's, I'm exactly where I need to be right now. If what you're feeling is confusion or indecision, maybe what you can tell yourself is, I will make a list of what needs to get done and take my best guess at where I need to start. Maybe a thought that you have is, I have all the resources I need to get started and finish this project. If you're feeling fear or anxiety, maybe what you can tell yourself is, I trust myself that I will figure this out. I will gather the information I need and I will use my judgment to make the best decision in the circumstances. If you feel imposter syndrome, it might be that the thoughts that you have are, I have the skills required to make this decision. I trust myself to finish the task. And finally, if what you're feeling is rushed and that's creating a gap for you, that's leading to procrastination, it may just be, I have the time I need to get this done. Maybe it's, this is important. I will make the time to get this done. So if we go back through steps 1 to 4, really what we're doing here is preamble work. I'm going to give you some strategies next, some sort of tried, true, tested, situational things you can do to improve procrastination. But what we've done here is we've set you up for success. So number 1, we have figured out what your go-tos are for procrastination. Number 2, we've looked at how it is you feel when you are procrastinating in relation to a task. Step 3, we've identified some of the thoughts that you have that might be triggering that procrastination. Number 4, identified what else you can tell yourself when you find yourself in that situation that might lead to a more empowering feeling that then drives the action of task initiation. So strategies. This is really, I think, what most people want from me when they talk about procrastination. And I will absolutely deliver strategies. And I will also share with you that I think they are so much more effective when you couple them with the work that we've just gone through. So strategies, number 1 is to set yourself up for success by minimizing distractions. I know you have heard this a million times, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's turning off the notifications on your phone. It might be closing the door to your office. It might be taking out a fresh sheet of paper so you can brainstorm your ideas on an uncluttered space. It might be giving yourself a particular window of time where you do not allow any emails to come in. It might be not looking at your phone for an hour. It's just that number 1 thing. It's right, setting up some physical barriers between you and distractions. And as I mentioned earlier, it won't help if you're still distracted at an internal level, which again is why it's so important to do that initial work of readying yourself for the task. Now, another task or a strategy that I highly recommend anytime that you are procrastinating is to write it down and make a list. I find that 9 times out of 10, when we are procrastinating, it feels like there's this wall between us and the task. It feels totally overwhelming. It feels scary. It feels like a bit of a monster. And what I've noticed is when you write down exactly what it is that needs to be done, when you give yourself a few minutes just to brainstorm some ideas, bullet items, whatever that looks like, what is the task, get that organized. If you do it in an electronic document, it can be an email to yourself. It can be just a simple Word document where you start iteming out those tasks and then you can rearrange them and play with them, figure out what it is. Number one, you'll see that it's actually not as bad as you think it is. It's always worse in your head. Somehow it's like the thoughts get all jumbled and they're kind of feeding off each other. But when you see them, then you can then discern, okay, well, this is a task that I do need to do. This is something that I don't really need to do. This one can go first. This one can go last. Maybe you give yourself some easy wins at the beginning. Maybe you give yourself some easy wins at the end and start with the really hard ones. I mean, it really depends on what works best for you. But I highly recommend writing it all down. Then you can see it. You can prioritize things. You can organize things. You'll see where you might need some help or some additional resources. And this will also give you a really great opportunity to manage your thoughts and your feelings. So if you look at that list and you notice that some of those bullet points, they kind of jump out at you, you feel anxious looking at them, you might pause there and ask yourself what it is about that particular task, right? If it's sending an email to the client where you're breaking bad news or you're asking for information and you don't know that client very well and you feel a bit awkward about it, then you can sit there and think about how you are thinking about it. Like, what is it that you're thinking that is making you feel awkward? And how else might you interpret that? What else might you tell yourself? So again, these are all reasons to write down the task and figure out how you can break it down, make it more manageable, organize it better, set priorities. Another thing that I recommend doing, and this we've already talked about a little bit, is to break it into tasks. So if you have a big goal, then take that goal and make it into smaller pieces, because it can be really overwhelming if what we do is sit down and say, I need to write the opinion to the client. Well, what if it was, I need to create a Word document or a memo document or some letterhead document. I need to gather my cases. I need to create an outline. I need to review the cases. I need to decide on the quotes that I'm going to use. I need to form my opinion. I need to write my executive summary. I need to fill in the blank, right? Gather the facts. So think about all the different steps that are required in order for you to complete that assignment, write them out, and all of a sudden you will see how some of them fit together and how you would structure it in a way that is most convenient for you. And when you have them all written down, now you've got a work plan. And this will be really helpful for the next suggestion that I have, which is to initiate the task using a trick. So this is kind of going back to the conversation that you're having with yourself. And if you can tell yourself, well, I only have to do X, then it becomes a lot more manageable to initiate a task. It's less overwhelming. So I'll offer 3 ideas on how to manage that task initiation. Number 1 is a Pomodoro method. So if you're familiar with this Italian timer, it's apparently shaped like a tomato, which in Italian is Pomodoro. Typically, the timer is set for 25 minutes, but there's no magic to 25 minutes. Pick a number that resonates with you. Maybe it's 13 minutes or 17 minutes or 30 minutes, whatever it needs to be. But give yourself a window of time where you're just going to start the task. And often what will happen is once you're in it, once you've initiated, once you've kind of gotten over that initial hurdle, it will flow so much more naturally for you. Salami method, similar idea. But what if you take that project, you've now broken it into tasks, and just start with one task? Or say, okay, I'm going to give myself a window to complete 3, the first 3 items on my task. So again, it's less overwhelming because you're only looking at 3 items. Another way to approach this is, what is one thing that I can do on this file? What is the easiest thing that I can do on this file? What is the thing that I can do that will create the most impact? So give yourself a question where the answer is not a huge, overwhelming task for you to do, but something really simple. And what that does is it actually gives you, because the next one, interestingly, is promise of reward. It gives you reward, that dopamine hit that comes along with checking an item off your list. That in itself is satisfying. It may also be that you promise yourself another reward. Maybe you get to walk around the block. Maybe you get to spend 5 minutes Googling anything that you want on YouTube. Maybe you have a chat with a friend or you grab a coffee. But give yourself a reward at the end of it. And the next task, I've got 2 more tips, is to create a good schedule. So much of this in terms of procrastination starts with having a well-managed calendar. I could go on at length, great length, and I'm not going to do that in today's episode about creating a good keeping time management system. But that is really going to help you with procrastination because now everything fits into a nice box in your calendar. So that is one of them. And another thing is to match the task and the energy. So that's what we were talking about with your chronotype. If you find that you are more effective in the morning, put those hard tasks there first, or the tasks where you've really been procrastinating. If you have high real estate, shove that task into a high real estate time zone for you, because then if you don't do it, let's say your best window is 9 to 10 a.m. in the morning, and you allocate that to a task that maybe isn't all that exciting, but you've been putting it off for weeks, all of a sudden the cost of not doing that is going to be greater, and that's going to motivate you to get it done. Another, and this is the last suggestion that I have for you in today's episode. I've got more suggestions, but wanted to keep it reasonably consumable with one episode, is to get outside help. And this person could be your assistant, it could be a colleague, it could be a coach, it could be a counselor. But basically what you want to do here is to invite somebody else to support you potentially. So if you worked with a coach, for example, someone like me, we would sit down, we would look at your practice, we would figure out where you procrastinate, we'd help you develop strategies that are specific to you to help you improve your practice. We'd create checklists and all that kind of thing to really get honed in on creating a practice that is very proactive versus reactive. It may also be that you engage or enlist the help of others for accountability. So maybe with your assistant and you say, listen, let's meet every day at 3 just so I can check in with you on what I've done in terms of my calendar. Have I done the things that I said I was going to do? Maybe you have a big file that you're working on and there are other team members, colleagues, or somebody that you report to. Maybe you schedule regular interval check-ins with them where you're going to discuss certain key milestones on the project that might help you keep motivated in relation to that project. So think about how you can use others in your office to help you push things forward. So to recap, the 5 suggestions that I have for you in today's podcast episode are: number 1, figure out your go-tos. Number 2 is to identify the feelings that you have when you go to those tasks and start to feel the urge to procrastinate. Number 3 is, what are you thinking that is creating those feelings for you? And then finally, what else can you think about the task in front of you? And the last, number 5, is the strategy. So again, minimizing distractions, making a list, writing things down, breaking your goals down into smaller tasks, initiate the task using a trick like the Pomodoro method, like the salami method, using the promise of rewards. Create a good schedule for yourself and get outside help. And if you want more help with procrastination, there are a number of episodes that I've recorded in relation to time management. I would invite you to scroll through some of the headings for the podcasts that I've already recorded. I will provide links to them in the show notes that appear on the website that hosts this podcast, thejoyfulpractice.com. Some of the terms you might look for are time management, planning, procrastination, your relationship with time. These are all filled with strategies on how to create better time management practices for yourself. The other episodes that I would also recommend are the ones that deal with emotions, because again, going back to executive functions, sometimes emotional regulation is what is impairing you or preventing you from taking action on the tasks that you want. It's creating that fear or that stress or self-doubt that is stopping you. And so I'd invite you to check out those episodes, the one about perfectionism, fear, self-doubt, thriving under pressure, dealing with overwhelm. So these are all emotions that might be standing between you and what you want to do. So if any of those resonate with you, I'd invite you to listen to those podcast episodes and see how the tools offered there can also help you. Now, the reason why these strategies will work, especially if you follow steps 1 to 4, is that you get to the root source. And it also helps you to step back and see the problem from an outsider's perspective. You get some objectivity there. And you know, right? You know intuitively that you don't want to procrastinate. And of course, the challenge is bridging the gap from inaction to action and knowing how you can work with your brain, how you can practice better thoughts, how you can effectively leverage your executive function and rewire it the way that you respond to procrastination. That is going to help you when you find yourself in a situation where you're inclined to procrastinate. You can break the cycle of procrastination. You can develop your task initiation muscles, and that over time will become your default practice. As that happens, of course, your confidence starts to build on itself, and you can start to trust yourself to initiate and follow through. So again, going back to that situation where you're procrastinating and you start to see yourself as a procrastinator, you will start to see yourself as somebody who gets things done. And what's so fascinating is that the more you practice this, the more you'll start to see that procrastination itself could actually become the thing that is uncomfortable. So if you've ever changed a habit, you know what I'm talking about. Once you change the habit, you don't really want to go back to the old one. So let's say you stop drinking coffee or you start an exercise routine. I know that happens for me. I like to exercise first thing in the morning, and I'm at a point where it's a habit. If I don't do it, it feels very strange to me. And so that's really what motivates me. I don't really rely on internal motivation. It's the habit. And if I don't do it, something just doesn't feel right to me. So that will happen for you too in relation to procrastination when you've developed that skill, when you've really practiced growing that muscle. Now, what will be required of you? Number one is really leveraging your executive function. This is sitting down, listening to this podcast episode and giving yourself the time to think about what I've mentioned here. I'm throwing a lot of information at you in a single episode. I know that, but plan in advance. Know your triggers. Have a plan. Leverage your ability to plan ahead of time to anticipate the obstacles, the thoughts that you might have, and what you're going to do when you come up against them. Other skills you're going to need to initiate, even when you don't want to. And I can tell you that the more you practice initiating, even when you don't feel like it, even when you're not motivated, that's going to help you build that muscle and it will become more of a reflex. You're going to need to practice. So just like you brush your teeth every morning and every evening, just like you need to practice time management and keeping on top of it, just like you need to practice law to stay sharp and to, know what's relevant here and all of it, you need to practice your task initiation. And the more you practice, the better you're going to get. And finally, the skill that you're definitely going to need as you go through this process, and even when you are defaulting to action as opposed to procrastination, which is grace. Giving yourself grace, because you are going to procrastinate. I can almost guarantee it. And you don't need to beat yourself up or get upset over it. I think it's totally fine to accept it as part of being human and allow yourself that grace. And you are not a procrastinator. You are somebody who sometimes procrastinates. So what can you expect as a transformation? Well, number one, you'll experience a lot of peace in your practice. You're going to feel a lot better when you're not putting tasks off, especially those really tedious tasks that I mentioned where you've put it off for so long that it is now the delay that is causing you to procrastinate even further. So your practice is going to feel different. You're going to feel a lot more proactive as opposed to reactive in your day-to-day. You will become a person who identifies as someone who used to procrastinate. Or maybe you're someone who sometimes procrastinates, as opposed to a procrastinator. You will start to see yourself as someone who gets the job done, someone who knows exactly what to do when the job feels too hard, overwhelming, or unpleasant. So, my friends, thank you for listening to today's episode. I am hoping that these tips are going to be helpful for you at any time that you feel that you are procrastinating, and especially right now as you come back from your vacation and jump back into work. I hope that these are strategies that will help you bridge that gap between knowing that you need to do something and wanting to do it and actually doing it. And if you would like some help implementing anything that you have learned in today's podcast episode, feel free to reach out and schedule a consult with me. We can talk about your practice. We can talk about your triggers, your goals, your short-term goals, your long-term goals. We can talk about how we can turn things around for you so that you're not putting things off in your practice, that you are getting things done in the way that feels good and right to you. You will feel more proactive, more reactive, and ultimately this would create a more joyful work experience for you. So if that's something that you're interested in doing, by all means, please feel free to reach out. And for all of you listening, thank you so much. I love having you here. I appreciate your loyalty and I appreciate you sharing this podcast with your friends. I appreciate the reviews that you write on iTunes and wherever it is that you get your podcast. And so thank you. It is a treat. It's an honor. It's a pleasure. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye and look forward to reconnecting with you again next week. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.